Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this month's Change Chats here at Truman Change. We're delighted for you to have you all with us this afternoon and to share a little bit of information with you. We are just going to wait a minute or two until everyone can come in. I can see that there's a flurry of activity now that Sarah's very kindly let everyone in from the waiting room. We have pinned our screen, so we are recording this session, but just to allay any concern or suspicions, the screens that are pinned are both mine and we're very fortunate to have Lucy on the call with us as well today. So it will only be Lucy and my videos that actually show up on the recording. You are welcome to have your camera on, of course. We like to see lots of smiley faces and engagement and what's getting great responses and what perhaps we need to exclude in future occasions maybe. You are of course very welcome to ask any and all questions as we go along, and indeed at the end as well. If you would like to put them in the chat, we have that open and are keeping a close eye on that. So I will be sure to read out any of those questions and get them answered for you. If you'd like to make a contribution at relevant points, then of course you're also welcome to do that. If you'd like to just sort of raise your hand using the relevant little button, and then we can bring you in at the relevant part, of course, unmute yourself, and then remember to mute it again just to avoid any potential distraction that may cause. I think we're about ready to get underway. So as well you're aware, today the topic of today's Change Chat is all around culture and the differences that can make, how best one might go about implementing that, and some of those real world experiences that we've had implementing and working alongside our local government and public sector more generally partners over the last 9 years or so. In fact, we just had a birthday recently, didn't we, Lucy?
We did, yeah, 9 years.
Yeah.
Changes 9 this year.
So very rarely for me, I'm going to try and keep quiet. So I'm going to do my absolute best. And it makes absolute sense on this occasion for me to do just that, because as I've said, we're very lucky to have Lucy with us today. Lucy, of course, Lucy Truman, the name's in the title, is the founder and managing director of Truman Change. She has worked in and around local government, public sector and police for the better part of 2 decades now, and has really focused and become quite sort of fixated, I think I'm not being unkind by saying that, on the people side of change, and culture is a real sort of strong suit. Lucy is just currently completing her final dissertation for a master's degree in organisational psychology, and has been very, very busy engaging with and interviewing a great many number of local government chief executives to ask them about their experiences with change and with culture during and post coronavirus era. So without further ado, I'll let Lucy speak and introduce herself and a little bit, and then we'll get into the sort of Q&A flow from there. So hi, Lucy.
Hi everyone, and thank you very much for joining us this morning. And I know there's a couple of familiar faces on here who've probably heard me speak on this topic before, but it's always nice to see people again. And yeah, really, we just thought an informal session. Darius will ask some questions, but anybody do feel free to ask questions. But I thought really culture, although it's something I talk about a lot, it feels like it is increasing in importance with our clients at the moment. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. I think that culture generally in the workplace has changed quite drastically since the pandemic. So people have different expectations of the workplace now than what they did 3 years ago. And there's lots of challenges around that, whether those challenges are the hybrid working, whether those challenges are around the pace of change. There are a lot of changes really there that I think organizations probably need to be mindful of how they are proactively helping that culture, the culture that they want to flourish, rather than necessarily just expecting it to be there in its own right. But I think it's also important because I think that, you know, in the recent couple of years, not just in the public sector, but in the private sector too, there's been a rise in conversations about toxicity in culture. So whether that's, you know, kind of misogyny and racism, there's been a number of reviews into blue light services, like there was the London Met Fire Service review, which was conducted by somebody who I know, Nazir Asfeld. There's been stuff in the police service, there's been, you know, kind of accusations in the BBC, and we're really in this space where people are starting to ask questions of how cultures can go very, very wrong and become quite a toxic place to work. So I think it's something that is much more on people's radars now. And as I said, very informal session. Do feel free to drop messages in the chat and to unmute and ask questions. We're always keen to learn from others and hear from others' experiences. So that's kind of what we're here for today. Darius, over to you. Interview me. You're on mute, Darius.
I do apologise. And thank you for that, Lucy. So I did neglect to mention that the recording for this, should you wish to watch it again or share it with colleagues or other people, will be available early next week on YouTube. We do have a Truman Change YouTube channel, which contains a recording of all past change chats. So if there was one that you've enjoyed in the past or would simply like to review those for your pleasure and information, then you're very welcome to do so. We will send out a link to that recording as well once that becomes available. So diving right in then to the first question, of course, culture is a vital and very important element of change, and a topic in and of its own right is, of course, Lucy. So why at the moment, or why right now, would you say that culture is more important than ever?
So I think that's back to what I said in the intro, really. It is that how do we make sure that our workplaces are fit for purpose in a post-COVID world, with people's expectations having changed quite a lot in terms of how they want to work. And that can manifest in, you know, that we hear a lot of people talking about working from home and hybrid, and how you maintain a culture in those kind of environments, what kind of culture you want. There's been a real movement, I think, towards people wanting to have more control over their work-life balance and their health and well-being. Some of that is helped by the working from home issue. Some of it is hindered because some people do struggle, myself included. I'm very guilty of this, struggle with those boundaries, and where, you know, working from home isn't perfect for everybody. So how you create the right culture and environment for people at the moment, it's almost as if a lot of things have been thrown up in the air, and now organisations are having to work that out. Or from scratch almost. We work with a wide variety of organisations, and I find it really fascinating how different they are, even though we predominantly work in local government. A lot of people would perhaps like to think that most councils are the same. They are wildly, wildly different, and in terms of where they sit on their culture and how they how it feels to work there is wildly different. So I think something about being mindful of that, and I don't think it's that easy to just suddenly change culture, but I do think that leaders are getting some awareness now that whether it's on purpose or by accident, they are shaping culture all the time. So I think there's an increase in that awareness, which is making people more interested in learning about it. I will say that I often ban the word culture when we're having workshops with clients, because it can be a bit of a fluffy concept that's not ideal for everybody. And, you know, particularly if we're working with staff at different levels or different stakeholders, or, you know, even community and residents, they don't really care what culture is. They care about how they get things done, which is sometimes a better definition. And the other reason I'm cautious about it is because often when people talk about culture that don't fully understand what it is, they mean this magical thing in the air that's over there that's nothing to do with them, when in actual fact culture is something that we are all shaping all the time. As I said, whether it's on purpose or not, we are all influencing it and shaping it all the time. So yeah, I do think it is a really important conversation at the moment, and it does feed into a number of other areas. And obviously our area is change and how you make change happen. Culture is a massive massive part of that. And I do think historically has been somewhat neglected. So in the past, people's approach to change, and actually still in the present, a lot of organisations do still take this approach to change, is very much in that kind of sequential project program management. It's controlling a process kind of way of doing change. And even though project and change management are two different disciplines, which is something that I try and rally against a little bit, the change management discipline itself is also quite sequential. So when you look at some of the models of change management, they tend to be moving through phases. I think culture's been a bit neglected in that, because how ready your organisation is for change is a cultural thing, and being able to identify that and figure out what aspects of your culture in your organisation will speed change up or slow it down will make a massive difference to how well your change programme actually goes ahead and how well it sticks. Because the other risk with focusing just on the processes, you can almost always demonstrate progress through a list of to-dos, but whether that change is actually embedded and sticking, that lies within the culture of your organisation more so than the Gantt chart that you've created, which I'm a trained project manager and I love a Gantt chart, my team will say. However, it's not that. It's people that make the change happen, not the plan. You do need both and you need a balance, but I think historically the balance has been too much on that and not enough on the people. And I think COVID particularly, and my research in COVID, where I'm interviewing people to understand what happened in organisations during that time, shows that there was this really interesting combination of those two disciplines. And it wasn't actually a project management discipline, it was more a crisis management kind of discipline. But that was a very kind of hard discipline of these are how decisions made, this is how we audit stuff, but combined with a very authentic leadership style with more co-design, more kind of we all just going to roll our sleeves up and figure out what we need to do, more partnership working despite the fact we couldn't be in rooms together. So that I think just reaffirms my instinct that you need both, but you need to be consciously using both rather than just defaulting to one or the other. So that's why I think it's important at the moment.
Yeah, okay, brilliant. So we've had a comment from Chris, who's agreeing with you and stating people often assume culture is driven top down from the leadership, for example, the chief executive, but I think subculture type cultures exist around organisations, both within and between teams.
Absolutely. And I think that is particularly prevalent in local government because it's so diverse in what it delivers, and we sometimes forget that. Those of us that have been in the sector a long time, it's normal to us, but actually it's a really challenging thing to deliver. So if you've got an organisation where you've got people who are, they come to work to look after the parks and they care really passionately about that, and then you've also got people who are maybe lawyers or finance professionals, you've got people that are looking after children in horrendous circumstances, you've got such a wide variety. You wouldn't necessarily, if you were starting from scratch and creating a business, you would not put all of those things together under one roof. So you've got there a range of different people with different motivations that are coming to work for very different reasons. You will absolutely have those subcultures. And it is worth saying that although it is top down to some degree of setting and the direction, actually people tend to leave a manager, not a job or not an organisation. So making sure that all of your managers in your organisation are skilled up and mindful and aware of what culture is a really, really powerful thing to do. And it is actually okay, I think. There's a different schools of thought, and there are a lot of people that really do espouse the whole golden thread, everything's got to align. I totally agree with that on a strategy basis, on a people basis. It's okay to have rebellious teams. It's okay to have teams that are motivated by different things. And actually, you kind of sometimes need them to be. In psychology, there's been a lot of work done on motivation based on risk or reward, which a really easy way to remember it is thinking about cats and cheese, because a lot of the research was done with rats and mice. So I'm just getting flashbacks because my cat brought a mouse in at 3 o'clock in the morning last night. I should be talking about mice. I'm not over that experience yet. But are we motivated by the smell of cheese, which is a reward, or are we motivated by the smell of cat, which if you're a mouse is obviously not a reward, it's fear-based. And I think that plays out really interesting in organisations, because in, for example, in local government, you will have frontline services that are very much about the cheese. They are very passionate about making the place better, whether that's for children, whether it's parts. They're passionate about the reward of making the place better. But then you've got a whole kind of profession, and some of the people will obviously be either or in each. It's not a complete blanket rule, but we've had to develop functions that are around risk mitigation. So your procurement teams are about making sure you don't get into trouble. Your finance teams are about making sure you've got control over your money. Your HR teams can be quite mixed, because some of them are about making sure that people are really thriving, but some are about making sure that everybody follows the rules and we don't get into trouble if we fire somebody. So you've got this real mix there of motivation. So obviously the culture in a risk mitigation kind of environment will be very different from the culture in a reward kind of driven environment. And I don't mean reward by money, I mean sort of personal reward of coming to work and making a difference. So it's absolutely normal for there to be those subcultures, and I don't think that's a bad thing. There will be other people that disagree with me on that. I think it's a case of, based on the team, what's the best way to move that team forward, and you kind of got to build on what you've got, I think, rather than necessarily try and blanketly assume that because you put a few posters up about values, everybody in the organisation has been sheep dipped. I don't think that works particularly well. It needs to be done because you need the clarity, but if you think it's done at that point, then there's probably still a long way to go.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it stands to reason, doesn't it, that whether the service is, sort of focused around aspiration or perspiration, that's really going to change the motivating factors, and therefore the culture, the type of people that are attracted to that type of work, of course, will also have an effect on the culture. And then just the fact that, I mean, it's 160, I forget, such a wide variety of different services and functions and such value that's delivered to the public each and every day across 400 authorities in the United Kingdom. I mean, to expect to be sort of anything uniform right across that would be quite the ask, wouldn't it? And it's perfectly understandable that there will be differences.
You do have some really challenging service areas that unfortunately have to be very, very motivated by both of those things. So if you take social care, for example, social workers go to work because they want to make a difference to people's lives. Nobody would choose that job for any other reason, because it's an incredibly difficult job that most of us would not have the emotional resilience to do. But they're also in a space that's very much around that risk mitigation and very much around, being cautious and making sure that processes are followed. They're heavily regulated. So you've even got within teams almost that contradictory complexity really that people have to learn to manage. So it's not a simple thing to create a consistent culture in a big complex organization, I don't think, and I don't think it's necessary. I think it's okay for it to be varied. Yeah, I agree with that. So we've sort of, I say we, it's the royal we, you have expressed your opinions and experiences around culture, why it's important generally, and even so more so as a result of the pandemic and the changes that's brought about. So would it be possible to sort of paint a picture or create a clearer definition of exactly what culture is, and then how we would go about breaking that down so that we can be, as you say, doing it on purpose rather than by accident? So my favourite definition of culture is that it's how messages are moved around the organisation. I think that's a really helpful definition because it's less fluffy and it enables you to think very critically about how messages are moved around and where there are contradictory messages, because that's where I think culture loses its way. So what we look at in terms of what messages are is it's not just what is verbally said. It's not just the obvious stuff. although that is a big part of it, which is, you know, what are people told, how are people communicated with, how do leaders behave? That is one component of culture. Another component of culture is your processes and your structures and how they send messages. So, for example, when you're working in organisations where, you know, we see in a lot of councils, particularly in adult social care, where recruitment and retention is a real issue. If we're pushing that and saying we need to recruit, but then the processes to recruit are extremely long and complex, then what we're doing there is sending a really contradictory message. So we're saying this is really important and we need to move fast on it, but actually the process is really complicated and difficult. So that's where it's interesting, is when you get those contradictions, and we see that a lot, and it's because processes and structures and systems have evolved over time, and they are slowing people down or focusing behavior in the wrong way. So that's the second aspect of it. The third aspect of it is a little bit more fluffy and a little bit more difficult to get a real handle on, and that's your kind of symbols and rituals. And what that's about is just thinking, what do things symbolize to your team? So this is really prevalent in the sort of hybrid debate of, and this is not a criticism in any way, because I think every organisation has to find their own way in this, dependent on their culture. But if you have, say, a management team saying, you know, we want everybody to work from home, but then they themselves are coming into the office, that is very symbolic of a contradiction where, you know, we're saying one thing, but we're doing another, and we're sending a message that's saying it doesn't really matter what I say, what I'm doing is I'm coming into the office. So it's things like that you've got to be very mindful. What would this actually symbolize? And so, like, another really petty example that I'm sure will make many of you smile, because it's something that we are all guilty of, is, you know, we say we want people to be really empowered and we want people to make their own decisions, but then some offices that you go in, there are just hundreds of posters everywhere about don't do this, don't forget this, make sure you do this. So you've got, what you're saying is you want people to feel empowered, but you've actually got quite a kind of domineering symbol of, here are all the things you have to remember, here are all the things that you have to do, here are all the signs that are up about, you know, don't forget to take milk out of the fridge and all that kind of stuff. All of that is symbolic. And the other thing that's really symbolic is the stories that are told. So if you're in an organisation where you want change to happen, and yet all of your managers are talking about a change programme that was 7 years ago that all failed in a complete disaster, that storytelling absolutely shapes the culture. So being very mindful about what stories are told, what messages are repeated, what are people talking about, is another really important tool. So what we do is we look at those three lenses. If you're really into this, if you've not heard of him, Edgar Schein, who actually passed away this year, is the sort of academic godfather of culture. He describes them as artifacts and has 8 of them. We've sort of merged them into those 3 groups, just because a lot of the work we do is with frontline staff, where we're, you know, asking questions about culture, and actually we have to make it so that it would be too complex to go through all 8 of those in a different way. So we apply our judgment as we need to. But that definition of its messages, and those messages travel in different forms, I think is a really useful way to look at it.
So Stuart has left a comment, which is to say that a lot of culture is embedded in the systems and procedures, as well as leadership and management practice.
Absolutely. And one of the best questions that we ask people about culture, where you know, particularly where we're avoiding talking about culture, is how do decisions get made? And when you ask that, how do decisions get made, you start to learn about the procedures in the organisation that are both the formal ones and the informal ones. And that does tell you a lot about where power resides and how quickly people can respond to things, and how they can make sure that you know, decisions are made quickly or thought through. It's really, really powerful. And again, you know, a contentious issue I see in councils, which I don't have a particularly strong view on either way, but, you know, we often bring in really kind of big HR systems where we want managers, frontline managers, to be much more self-service. And I think that works really well in some organisations and it doesn't work well in others. but that then does shape the behavior of, you know, you are in control of your staff and we need you to do this, as opposed to a HR function doing it. So even just when you bring a system in, how that system is implemented makes a big difference to your culture. And that's something that is often missed with those system implementations. They're not designed or implemented with that in mind. You know, people get on that, and, you know, the IT industry is very much a user of project management methodology. It's not the originator. Project management methodology came from engineering. PRINCE stands for projects in a controlled environment, which is why it does work in those kind of ways. It does work in the, you know, when you buy a big IT system, you need a Gantt chart, and you need to know how much it's going to be, and you need to know what order everything's going to happen in. So it's the right tools for that, but often misses that question of, okay, but how is this system and the way that we use it going to impact the culture of the organization? That's a question that's often forgotten to ask. And even when people invest in change management support, when they bring in systems in, it's even missed in that point. And it's often change management is then seen as training people how to use the system, rather than actually what change is this system creating, and what change do we want it to create, and how do we make sure that it does do that. I see a lot of people spend a lot of money on IT systems thinking it will create efficiency, and actually people then finding ways to work around the system because they're not engaged with it, and then almost creating a culture of, we're all here trying to do our best work, but this IT system is awful and we can't do what we need to do. So it's definitely very important around systems and procedures, and a neglected area, I would say.
Interesting. So we've established that culture is can be you know, the golden thread, like you say, strategically coming from the top and filtering down, but more so it actually sits within particular functions and systems and roles and purposes, aspiration, perspiration, function, all these different factors are involved. So given that really the sort of majority of this is taking place at that sort of delivery level, or, you know, functional level, can you suggest a way that a particular team or service individually might shed some light on their own culture?
So there are some really good questions you can ask. So the how do decisions get made is a great question to ask. The question of how do things get done around here is another great question to ask. We do go in and do culture mapping, we call it, which we don't actually need to do as much as you would think. You know, once we've run between sort of 5 and 10 workshops, depending on how big the organization is, we start to see repetitive themes. So it's not something that you need to speak to every single person in the organization to get a grip of. There's an argument that it's useful to do that from an engagement point of view, but actually from picking up a culture, we can pick it up very, very quickly. And we pick it up through those 3 headings. We go in and we ask. It's helpful if you've got a change program in place or a vision for the future. So it's helpful if you can articulate at the start of these sessions, look, this is the kind of organization we're trying to build. And then if you ask the question, okay, so tell me how the systems and processes and structures we have help or hinder us to get to that place, then that will get you to a very clear view of where there are issues in that area. Then ask the same sorts of questions around behavior. So what behavior do you see? And is that aligned with what we're trying to build, or is it not? And then the third one, which people struggle with a little bit more, is that kind of symbols and habits and routines. So I then focus on what regular meetings are there, what stories do you keep hearing, what phrases do you keep hearing? So, you know, people, one organization we did it with, the phrase that was often repeated was, how would that look in the Daily Mail? Now, without judgment, that can be a good benchmark in some situations, it can be a bad benchmark in others. So in some situations it's a check of, are we doing stuff and the public would approve, and how would that be perceived in the public eye? That's a good sense check. It's not a great sense check if you're trying to reduce risk averse behavior. So you can see how you apply it without judgment in terms of, well, that's the wrong thing to say or the right thing to say, but you just think about, what does that phrase do? What does it do? What does it communicate? And I think that if you go under those 3 headings and you go under those with that vision of the future in mind, it helps people to, in a non-ranty way, sort of reflect on what's happening in the organisation. And we do those sessions, a mixture of doing them face-to-face or virtually. There's benefits to both. Face-to-face, I think, is a much more human way to do it. However, the benefit of virtually is when we do it, use a tool, which you could use face-to-face as well, a tool called Mentimeter, which means that people can contribute to the discussion anonymously. So they can literally just type their thoughts in and it comes up so that it's there so everybody can see it, but it is anonymous. So there's some, depending on the culture of your organisation at the moment and how sort of transparent and honest it is, that can work quite well. Some places people don't feel comfortable speaking up, some places they do. If they do feel comfortable speaking up, then face-to-face and having those conversations in a group can be quite, what's the word? I feel like healing is too dramatic of a word, but it can be quite bonding. And particularly if you're clear about that vision that you're working towards, this is a really quite deep engagement with your staff to say, you tell me where our blind spots are. And every single organisation I've done this with has found blind spots where they're saying one thing and doing another, and they had no idea. So a really good example was an organisation I worked with, but I use this example quite a lot because I think a lot of organisations relate to it, where they wanted to reduce sort of silo thinking in their senior managers, and they wanted people to work across directorates and across the council instead of working just in their own area. And yet when we did this exercise and we really delved, it turned out that one of the criteria for their job evaluation process was that you get paid more if you've got a bigger team. So that's a complete contradiction. You're financially rewarding people to empire build when you're saying that's not the thing that you want them to do. And the organisation had no idea, you know, because that was a process that had been set up and seemed fair at the time with the information that they had at the time, that actually then they started to realise that from an employee point of view, that was a direct contradiction. So there'll be loads of those in your organisation. There'll be absolutely loads where you're saying one thing, but then you're communicating something different. And that's when you get this sense of culture feeling like you're wading through treacle and you're struggling to get stuff done because people don't actually know, because you're sort of confusing them with the message. So yeah, I would, what we do is we run workshops, and we do have a white paper that talks through this process more. So if you wanted to have a go at doing it yourself, you're welcome to download the white paper. There is a benefit sometimes to having an outsider do it. I know I would say that, but there is a benefit sometimes to having an outsider do it. An outsider will come to it cold, so they will ask the questions and make people explain it, whereas you as an internal person will come with your assumptions already. And also sometimes people open up to outsiders a lot more because they're independence. But we work through those three headings and we get as much information as possible. We then do a thematic analysis on it. So we look at what things keep coming up again and again and again. And then we feed that back to our client with an action plan of, here are some key things that, knowing what future you're trying to build, that this is where we think you might need to make some change in terms of the real concrete, tangible things that will influence your culture, instead of just saying, well, your culture is not great. You know, you need to know what to change specifically. And that honestly is, although we use the same process with different clients, every single review that we've done like that has been wildly different. We've had stuff come out where it's been, use of the word family, and then that actually going too far and saying, well, it's cliquey. So you've got some people saying we're like a family here, and then some people describing almost a dysfunctional family. So we've had stuff around that. We've had stuff around processes. I have actually had one organisation where everybody was really positive about the processes. I was like, my goodness me, 20 years in the public sector and I've never had this before. Every single organisation I go in complains about, procurement and HR and all that kind of stuff. But I have had one that didn't, and that the staff spoke very highly of it. And then, we've had stuff around spending too much time in meetings, not being able to get any work done. We've had, there would be, if you go through the process, there'll be a lot of stuff that's familiar that you already know about, but that you're not quite sure how to change. And then there'll be some surprises in there as well, like the example with job evaluation process. So it's a real mix, but it's a real depth of getting to a place where you create the right environment for the change to happen, rather than just, doing a Gantt chart and expecting it to happen sequentially.
Yeah, brilliant, thank you. So Sarah's been kind enough to share a link to the white paper. If you did wish to view that, download it and fill it in, then that's available for you in the chat there. Chris has also added a comment whilst we were just chatting there. It's in relation to the effect of IT systems and implementing new sort of process and practice, and the effect that has on culture. And he's put, it was indeed very difficult to get people on board, especially social workers who generally hate IT. Yes, that is very true. When we were implementing a new case management system, when we were replacing a system that had been implemented just 5 years early on the same basis of improvement. It helped me as an analyst to concentrate on how the new system would improve the working day of real people.
It's really, really important and often forgotten. And I'm sure, regardless of which area you work in, every single one of us on this call has got a horror story of a system that came in that was supposed to make it better and made it worse. I think that there's probably not enough engagement with the frontline staff in these kind of projects, and there's also an interesting sort of pendulum swing where there are some organisations that buy off-the-shelf systems, and then there are some that bespoke them to within an inch of the life, so they're completely unrecognisable. I think there's a happy medium between them, because sometimes the ones that bespoke end up actually just recreating the old inefficient system. And so we, obviously on a smaller scale, we're a small business. We've got, I think 13 staff. We recently implemented a CRM. Sarah's probably cringing, who's our change chat admin, because she's one of the people that's responsible for it. And it's been such a journey of buying the off-the-shelf bit and then figuring out what works for us and what doesn't. And I, as the managing director, am still very involved in that process. So that is a constant, reflection of, okay, well, if we worked in this way, would it help us or would it not? So it's a really complex and difficult thing to do and to get right, but very often neglects the people using the service. And particularly when you get into areas like social care, where there is that perception that social workers hate IT systems, which is probably a fair perception, that narrative makes it easy to just think, well, we'll not bother engaging them because they'll hate whatever we do, which is really quite dangerous. So it's a challenging thing, and keeping up to date with technology is tough. The technology that, even just ChatGPT and all of that kind of stuff that 2 years ago we hadn't even heard of. So keeping up to date with that is hard. And again, cultural in terms of organisations. So some organisations are comfortable with evolving their systems and processes over time. Some organisations are not, and that's where they end up using the same system for 10 years and then it almost breaks down, or the providers will no longer provide support for it. So yeah, it's a massive driver for culture, and an area that is just neglected. I think people don't think of IT systems as impacting culture when they do massively, because we're all using them all the time.
Yeah. So one last question for you, if that's okay, Lucy. Yeah. I don't know if this is a bit of an oversimplified question, perhaps, but it's one that's that I've been considering. Is that, given all the specifics and the different functions and cultures and subcultures and processes and procedures and leadership styles and everything else we've discussed, and perhaps a few other items as well, is there a way to fix culture?
So yes and no. So I don't think that there is a quick fix to culture, but I also don't think that's an excuse to do nothing about it. So I think it comes down to awareness, and I really do think that's the most important thing. And I know this is a repetition of what I've already said, we are all shaping the culture all day, every day, whether it's on purpose or not. So it's about taking ownership as a leader of paying attention to that and making sure that you're doing it on purpose rather than by accident. And that's tough. And in terms of how do you fix it, I think it is fixable over long term. I describe it as more of a shaping than a fixing, and a conscious shaping, because if you don't do anything, it will still be there and it will still evolve of its own volition. And actually, if you're just one lone voice in the dark, you're probably not going to be able to fix it. So it's about being aware of what are the things that you think need to be fixed is the first question. And that's understanding where those contradictory messages are. That's a massive step forward for fixing it. If you are saying one thing, but your staff are experiencing something else, it doesn't matter how many times you say it. You know, if you're saying we need to be more efficient, but your systems and processes are not, if you're saying we need to move at pace, but you've got like a 45-stage decision-making process, doesn't matter how many times you say it, doesn't matter how many times you communicate it. So that's where the awareness comes in of where are those blind spots where there are things happening that you weren't aware were contradicting your message. So that is absolutely step one. And step two, which is kind of linked to that really, is you modeling the behavior that you want to see and you rewarding the behavior that you want to see. So, you know, being positive and looking for the good news stories. We're working with a client at the moment where I've been challenging them on their comms approach to change, because they do what so many organisations do, and I've done it myself when I had less experience. We think we need to communicate about our change programme. Yeah, we need to communicate. Everybody knows we need to communicate. So we'll do a page on the internet or whatever the channel is, and we'll tell them that we've had a board meeting and we'll share with them the plan. And all you're doing is communicating about a process that they don't care about. You're not communicating about what is the change that you want that to see from them. You're not communicating about what will be different and how that matters to them. You're almost just doing the process of change. And if you want to change culture, you have to be looking for that change and celebrating it and promoting it, rather than necessarily just saying, well, we've had another board meeting and we've done this. You need to be talking about the change that you want to see, so that makes it real for people. And I do think that, again, this is a simple question, but one that is really, really tough to answer. The what will be different is crucial. So if you want to fix your culture, then you need to be able to articulate very clearly what will be different. And you need to articulate that for multiple audiences. So what will be different for your staff? What will be different for your residents? What will be different for specific groups of staff, if that's relevant? What will be different for your members? What will be different for your senior managers? Being able to answer that question of describing that future from all those multiple perspectives will enable you to really identify where there are places that just isn't working and where it is, so that you can celebrate that and promote it. But I honestly think without the awareness, when people just say the culture's bad and can't, and then usually says something like, well, you know, morale's low, something that's, you know, not really tangible, not really descriptive, then I think they're the people that will really struggle to fix it, because you've got to really nail down where it is and what the issue is. And that will mean looking in the mirror and taking some responsibility, because although I don't subscribe to the view that it 100% comes from the top, if you're contradicting it yourself, it's not going to change. So we all have to take some responsibility as leaders as to how we influence and shape and model that culture that we want to see. And then we have to remove the barriers that are in the way, you know, like the decision making. If we want people to act at pace, we have to make sure we're not slowing them down. And I know that's easier said than done in some cases. I know that there's, you know, a lot of rules and regulations around local authorities, and we can't just do what we want whenever we feel like it. But I do see wild differences in terms of how quick decisions get made, how quick action is taken between different councils. So a big element of that is not the statutory stuff that's around it. It is the culture within the organisation, which is what I mean about taking a good hard look in the mirror. And also just being not too judgmental about it, because I think people have very fixed views about what is good practice and bad practice. And one of the privileges I have as a consultant is seeing so many different versions of how things are done. And in some ways, when I was earlier in my career, I was much more fixed on what was good and bad. And now, as I get a bit more older and wiser, I'm less fixed on what's good and bad. It's what's good and bad in that context, in that environment, because the context is very different in different environments. So, you know, what looks like a good, slick, clean process in one area of the council may be very different from another. You can't really apply, you know, like lean methodology in the same way to a process for getting an invoice paid. Absolutely works really well there. Or children's social care, you know, it ain't going to work as well there. And you might want more human element there than you would here, where you just literally processing a piece of paper. So context is huge. And I think some organisations do, when they get into a very fixed view of what culture should be, I think it's a bit risky. It's okay for stuff to be slightly different, I think, and it's okay to do some of that thinking without too much judgment. Like the example of hybrid working, I've heard so many different views on that. I'm only really qualified to say what works in my organisation, and everybody's got to figure it out for themselves based on their own culture, their own place, you know, their own priorities, their own ways of working. There's not necessarily always a good and bad. So yeah, it isn't, is it fix or is it shape? I think it's shape, and I think it's personal responsibility, and it is in it for the long game, but also you can accelerate that, because I sometimes cringe when people say, well, it'll take years to change the culture. To some degree it will, but you can get some quick wins and change some pretty big things pretty quickly. And the pandemic showed us that, you know, culture and ways of working and people's expectations and people's motivation changed rapidly in the space of a few days in the pandemic. So it is possible to do it very quickly. I'm not advocating for that level of crisis being driving every change, but it is possible to do it quickly. But it's you've got to be realistic about, and even if you think it's fixed, it never is. It's not a project culture. It is a long-term commitment, well, a forever commitment, really, for as long as your organisation is running, to making sure that it is what it should be, rather than something that you can suddenly throw something at and it's fixed. It's a conscious shaping. You might choose to throw some resource at it to help figure out what the current issues are and to pay a bit more attention to it, and that's definitely not a bad thing. But it's always going.
Yeah, it's an ongoing process, not a finite equation.
Mm.
Yeah, I think that's been maybe a bit of a theme developing through a couple of your responses so far, is that it isn't you know, an A to B, it's an A to Z with sort of every step along the way. And there's certainly, like you say, no harm in getting some initial help at first, but it's really about embedding that sort of change process or a deliberate sort of plan or strategy, but also equally important periodically, whether that's once a year, once every 3, 4, whatever it might be, to take a look at it and see how the landscape has changed, because there's nothing worse than implementing a 2-year-old plan that really hasn't applied for the last 18 months, you know, or the circumstances that surround it have changed as well.
Yeah, and the other important aspect to it is, and I haven't figured this out yet, but I worry about the use of the word change, which is somewhat ironic, seeing as we are called Truman Change. But that in itself suggests that there's a task and finish. Actually, in public service and in private sector, but organisations are there to respond to the needs of others. We're not there in our own right. So we're there to deliver services for the community, and the needs of your community, for a start off, varies wildly, you know, and I know that from working with lots of different councils, but also that varies over time as well. So to think that you can at some point, even if you did create the perfect organisation and the perfect culture, that moment will pass pretty quickly, because society is changing all the time. People's expectations around technology are changing all the time. People's expectations around health are changing. You know, at the moment we've got, you know, it grieves me to say we're through the pandemic, because we're not, because we're still getting hit by certainly the after effects of it. But we've got food poverty crisis, we've got grants that we have to respond to very quickly. So that's something that we help a lot of organisations with, where there's just, you know, this is a priority, here's some money, make it happen. We've got the climate change crisis. We've got all sorts of issues around health and social care. You know, there's always a pandemic. It just isn't necessarily a pandemic. And there's always changes. And even when those changes are longer over time, like a lot of the issues we have in adult social care are because we have an aging population. Now, that's not happened overnight, but it's still about us, our ability to make change happen within our organisation in response to that need. And that's never, ever going to go away, which is why I think that there's something about the way that culture and change is framed as a task and finished project that isn't right. And actually, we need to be training our leaders who have often been trained in management. I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of defining management and leadership, because I think that's been done to death. But we've trained them in control. We've trained them how to manage budgets and people and tasks and workflows. But actually, have we trained people in how to be responsive to community need? Have we trained people to do change without it being a project, but actually that constant evolution of how do I need to make sure that my people and my team are doing the best they can in a changing world? And I think the answer to that is no. I don't think we have always done our best for people in that regard. And change versus BAU are two very different mindsets, which somehow we need to find a way to bring together, which is challenging because they are very different mindsets. One is about stability and control, and one is about kind of instability. So we've got to figure that out. And I think all of that applies to culture too, because if we are responsible, taking responsibility for shaping our culture, we're shaping it. We're not shaping it in isolation in a closed door. We're shaping it in the context of how we do the best for our communities, and our communities' needs are changing all the time.
Yeah.
Another reason why the job's never done. Sorry, call.
Multifaceted, to say the least. Then, so we've had a few more comments that have come in whilst we've been talking. So Stuart added a comment to say change management is quite often seen as just training and communication.
Yes, it is. Yeah. And there is a big part of that. You know, we do need to train people and we do need to communicate with them. But I think it should be much more two-way. It should be much more about engagement, and it should be about consciously preparing people for what will be different, which isn't just training. And actually, they might know better than us how to do it. You know, training is a very sort of top-down approach. I would never for 1 second think that I could go into areas of local government and know more. You know, we're doing a piece of work at the moment in a planning team. That's a highly technical skill set. I can't tell them how to do their job. I can help them map through it, and I can facilitate it, and I can give them feedback about the culture and the ways of working, and we can do some analysis with them. But the people on the front line might actually know better, and usually do know better. So if your approach to change is telling people what to do, you're really missing out on a massively valuable resource.
Another comment we've had is how do you, again from Stuart, is how do you get around the blind spots of people to enable awareness of the cultural challenge?
Oh, well, I mean, I feel like I need more context to answer that question well. The people do have blind spots about their own behaviour, and that is often a challenging conversation. I always think it's funny when people ask about self-awareness and like, do any of us actually know how self-aware we are? No, we don't. We've no idea, have we? So there's something about creating a culture. There's a really good book called Radical Candor, which is by a lady called Kim Scott, which is a process for doing feedback. I think from memory she was involved in Facebook, I don't know, but it's to do with giving feedback in a way that combines awareness of performance but also caring for the individual. So I think that's quite a good book to read on how to create the environment where you have more open feedback that enables people to see their blind spots. So I think that's positive. There are other ways, like obviously your 360-degree feedback that are more formal, which do work really well in some organisations. I have found that the concept of that culture is about messages being cascaded helps with that blind spot issue, because it's less attacking. So you're not saying your behavior is doing this. What you're saying is, here's one set of messages and here's another set of messages. And I've had that conversation with a client recently where I've said, okay, so you've got your senior leadership, your chief exec saying this. and then you've got your team leaders saying this, can you see how that's confusing? So that's not attacking anybody, and that's quite a nice way to do it. And that's why I think that cascading of messaging is a nice way to view culture, because it's less judgmental and less attacking. If you can come up with 2 or 3 examples of different messages, it's not having a go, it's a how do we resolve this. Hopefully that helps a little bit. I won't talk too long.
So the next comment is again from Stuart, and I'm just trying to tie it back, but what he stated is he agrees and says people like to lift and shift changes, but context is always different. Oh God, yeah. One of my favourite projects, I'm still in touch with the team, and it was years ago, was setting up a regional adoption agency. And it was basically, it was a government-driven agenda to centralise adoption services, which if any of you are from like children's social care, I'm sure you'll have heard of it. And we did one where it was 6 local authorities and 2 voluntary sector. And honestly, just going through that process of even process mapping some of the way that they did stuff that's highly regulated. It's not like you just make it up as you go along. There's a lot of rules around adoption, and the difference between how they were all done was wild, and it was great fun and great because we did that with the staff right from as soon as we knew that we were going to do it. We co-produced all of the processes with the staff from all of the councils, and there were some really heated debates about how to do stuff. But yeah, the context is always different, and that's what gives me the joy though in the job that I'm in, is that I never get tired of doing it, because every new client is a new client, and I can take all my expertise and my experience from elsewhere, which hopefully is of some value, but that getting to know a new organisation never gets old for me. Absolutely, I agree with that. So a comment from R, which is engaging people, upskilling and preparing them to understand their roles in the change and ensuring they are capable to embrace their processes. Absolutely, it's that two-way engagement. There is some training and the upskilling. I think it is that what will be different question that's really magic there, because when you apply that, and I've spoken to a few people recently actually about the use of personas, which isn't always used in change, but we use it it's from a marketing discipline, where if you were marketing a business, you would be like, okay, what's our dream customer? Where do they hang out? And you describe them. But actually we use that in change programs as well, because when you do that and you apply that, and then you start thinking, okay, so what will be different for that person? You start to come up with ways that you can engage and communicate with those groups of people in a way that's relevant for them, that they care about, instead of, like I said, putting a Gantt chart on an intranet page and expecting people to check it. Yeah, okay. So Craig has said most organizations desire stability, and changes create uncertainty. Our leaders feel uncomfortable with this uncertainty. I feel there is something to explore about how leaders can feel more stable in a period of uncertainty. I will come back to you on this, because there's a really good book called Be More Pirate. And I don't know, I can't remember the guy's name who wrote it, but the guy who wrote that book is trialing a science-backed approach to training people in their tolerance to uncertainty, and I've signed up for it. And basically they do like an uncertainty tolerance measure at the start, and then you watch 3 one-hour documentaries which are designed to sort of stretch your thinking, where they interview people that have been involved in lots of different uncertain environments. They talk about uncertainty creating fear fog and something else which I can't remember because I've not gone through the whole thing yet. But I think that's an interesting concept, because when you look at it through that lens, so I scored quite high on tolerance to uncertainty, which isn't really a surprise to anybody given my career. I'm an entrepreneur, got my own business, I'm fine with uncertainty, I'm making it up as I go along. But there's a lot of individual differences there. So if you have an organization with people that are not scoring high on uncertainty tolerance, then actually uncertainty is really challenging for them. And I do think that that's something I've had to learn through my career. I've realized that about myself, that I probably have a higher sense of it than other people do. I'm more comfortable with it than other people are. It's not an easy thing to fix, and there is
almost the way that our brains work is wired to, we want to form habits. We've got lazy brains. We don't want to be, that's why when you drive somewhere and you can't remember how you got there, it's because you want to be in autopilot most of the time, which obviously is in direct contradiction to change. So I don't have an answer to it yet, because it's an area that I'm just learning about and really researching. I think there is a lot around guiding through that and shining a light on it and being transparent in change programs, where what we know and what we don't know, and being comfortable with saying that, because sometimes what leaders do is they just don't communicate if they have nothing to say, and that's quite a mistake. You're better off saying, here's where there is certainty and here's where there isn't, and this is what we're doing to work through it. So I think it's an awareness of it that helps. But I will maybe do another change chat on uncertainty once I've gone through that program.
The ideas are coming in. So I'm just conscious we are running a little short of time, but we do have one last comment just for now, which is from Rebecca, who says, a challenge for leaders with managing change that's not defined as a project and is ongoing is, how do you be seen to be doing when your boss taps you on the shoulder?
So I think, at the risk of being repetitive, it comes back to answering that what will be different question, because if you've answered that question, you can start to watch for that difference and you can start to demonstrate that difference. So we have done in some organisations an approach to project management where, instead of starting with your PID and your process, we've actually started with that, what will be different at the end of this project, and then work back from it. So I think that's the answer. Be clear on what the change is that you want to see, and then be looking for that change. So you rather than telling your boss what you're doing, you're showing your boss what's happened and what as a result. I think that might be a good solution.
Yeah, the proof of the pudding's in the eating, right?
It is.
Okay, well, that's been really interesting and informative. I know that I've learned a lot. I hope everyone who's joined in today has enjoyed it and taken some value from it. We are, of course, here anytime for informal chats to be a sounding board, or to, you know, offer a view or share some experiences that we might have on any of the topics. You can contact us through the website, social media, or email, of course. As I've already said, the recording will be available in the next few days, Monday, Tuesday of next week on YouTube. We'll be emailing a link to that out too. And then just one last thing I'd like to mention before we bring the session to a close is that, should you wish to take some further stock of your position of where you currently are in terms of your change programs and culture mapping and things of all that nature, I think Sarah is going to kindly share the link in the bottom if she hasn't already, which of course she has brilliantly. And so the link is there for the scorecard. So you answer 12 really simple questions. It then provides you with a personalized review and highlights the areas that you may be facing some challenges around. So that is available for you at any time as well. So once again, thank you very much, everyone, for setting aside this hour on a rather beautiful Friday afternoon. It is here on the Fylde Coast. I hope it is where you are too. And we look forward to seeing you again next time round.